Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third session in our Reimagining Academia series hosted by the Office of the Vice Principal, Culture, Equity, and Inclusion here at Queen's University. Our topic for today is Accessibility Matters, Redefining Equity in Canadian Academic Institutions. Our speaker is Dr. J. Dolmage, professor at the University of Waterloo, and our moderator will be Kate Brothers, Special Projects Officer here at Queen's University. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Queen's University is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We recognize that these lands have been inhabited and cared for by Indigenous peoples long before the establishment of this institution. And we are grateful to live, learn, and work in this territory. As we reflect today on accessibility and equity in academia, we also recognize the ongoing impacts of colonization and our shared responsibility to work toward more inclusive and just institutions. Thank you again for being here. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kate. Kate, thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. So today we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Jay Dolmage. Just to give a brief bio, Dr. Jay Dolmage is a professor and associate chair at the University of Waterloo. He specializes in rhetoric, composition, and disability studies. He's a leading scholar in the field of disability and accessibility in higher ed. His research explores how rhetorical traditions intersect with ableism and institutional barriers. He's the author of several books that bring together rhetoric, writing, disability studies, and critical pedagogy. These books include Disability Rhetoric, Academic Ableism, and Disabled Upon Arrival, Eugenics, Immigration, and the Construction of Race and Disability. Dr. Dolmage is the founding editor of the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies as well. We're so happy to have him here.
Thank you very much, Kate. So my name's Jay. I'm in my office today. It's a cluttered room. There's stuff on the walls and piles of books that I need to read. I'm a middle-aged white guy. I'm wearing dark glasses, thinning blonde hair. I'm wearing a green shirt. I have a bit of tea today because my throat is bothering me a little bit. And I want to thank everybody for taking time out of their day to talk about what I think is a really important subject. I think and my talk today is designed to the comments part of our work today. From me, I just want to kind of give us a grounding. I think there are some myths and misunderstandings around disability in higher education that are circulating right now, and I want to present you with some of the data to paint a picture that's a little bit more accurate, but then also to give us some metaphors to think about disability and how it's historically been constructed. Some ways to think about the tools that we've been given to think about including students with disabilities, including disability on our campuses, and the limits of those tools, and then also lots of space to talk about what we might do to create change, right? Change that could happen in the classroom as early as tomorrow. And lots of time for us to share ideas and have questions as part of our time together today. So I think the first thing that I want to say, give me a second here. I know I'm sharing my screen here, so you can see my slides, and I'll move through those as I talk. Sorry, give me 1 second. I think the first thing to say is that we working at universities, we're working within an ableist culture, right? And that means that a lot of the values that are put across in higher education, they value able-bodiedness, norms around sociality, there are values around perfecting minds and bodies. And in some ways, there might be no more ableist place than a university, right? And at the same time, we also know that we have some tools to try to understand the cost of the rhetoric of ableism, right? But the truth is, universities really do continue to function to keep some folks out of the workforce, to keep people out of access to knowledge and power and dialogue. And they do so pretty effectively and efficiently, right? In 2022, 27% of Canadians aged 15 years and older had a disability, right? And that seems to have been climbing a little bit since 2017, 5% higher than 22% in 2017. 24% of first-year university students in Canada self-declare as having a disability, so that matches up pretty neatly with the average for that age group. But that's in really stark contrast to the 6 to 9% of students who actually seek and get accommodations, right? We have a generation, the National College Health Assessment tells us that this cohort of students that we're teaching and we see in our classrooms right now, there's two distinct things about this cohort that are different than previous generations, right? The first thing is, one, they find higher education more disabling than previous cohorts, right? The second is that they're much less likely to seek help. We know that, for example, in the United States, while 94% of students with learning disabilities in high school get accommodations, only 17% of those same students get those accommodations when they get to college or university, right? At the same time, in the States, some studies show that 2/3 of college students, their college or university will never know about their disability because they will never disclose that disability. And that holds true even more so in most Ontario universities. The Canadian Campus Wellbeing Survey, which was last done in 2022, it showed that at my own university, the University of Waterloo, 75% of Waterloo students indicated, 75% of students with disabilities at the University of Waterloo indicated that they did not seek accommodations for those identified disabilities or ongoing medical conditions. Okay, so that's very different than the common rhetoric out there that tells us that there are more disabilities than ever before, more diagnoses than ever before, and more accommodations than ever before. In fact, what's happening is that we have as many disabled students on our campuses as we have in the general population, but something on campus is telling them not to seek help, even when they had that kind of help and support in high school. We know this holds true for mental health related disabilities as well. That in fact, for many students who stopped attending college because of mental health related reasons, they knew that they could access mental health services and supports, right? They knew they had the ability to get accommodations, but they never were going to disclose that to their college or university. So that's the first thing I want to say. I think we have a crisis of help seeking around disability. And it's altogether too easy to sort of blame students and say, oh, students should be seeking help. But I think what it actually spurs us to do is to examine the help itself, right? How can we reshape this help? How can we change what we're doing if the system that's in place is not being utilized? Okay, because the outcomes, that's the other piece here, is the outcomes are bad, right? 27% of Canadians have university degrees, but only 17% of Canadians with mild or moderate disabilities have degrees, right? 49.5% of students with disabilities are even able to complete their university degrees within 6 years, right? More students are enrolling than in previous eras, but nearly nearly 2/3 are unable to complete their degrees within 6 years, right? Disabled students, when they do graduate, are going to have 60%, up to 60% more student debt, right? There's actually a lawsuit in the news recently challenging Canada's federal student loans program for its role in creating that debt inequity. And the outcome then, I think we can say that somewhere in the neighborhood of 100,000 Canadian post-secondary students right now have the right to accommodations, but will never seek them. They're in our classrooms right now, right? And you will never get a letter from Disability Services about those students, right? But we have to understand that, right? And then we have to create change whether those students are going through the Office of Disability Services or not. And this is a disciplinary question too, right? Of students with disabilities. So to begin with, let's look at STEM, right? We know that disabled people have made huge contributions within STEM, right? Disabled scientists are responsible for discovering at least 22 elements of the periodic table, right? But those scientists face real barriers to their participation. Right now, because of lack of access in lab courses, only 4.3% of post-secondary students with disabilities choose natural sciences as their field of study, right? And we know that the big difficult questions in STEM, we need disabled researchers to be able to properly answer those questions. Like I said, the outcomes are not good. It's not good when we begin pressing and breaking it down by discipline as well, right? We need to be building a more equitable pathway for disabled students. The metaphor that I often use around the history of disability in higher education is the steep steps. The one backdrop that I use for this often is the film Monsters University. So if you've seen that film, the animators, the Disney and Pixar animators for that film, they studied very traditional looking campuses, right? They could have studied buildings at Queens. They studied Stanford, Harvard, University of Toronto. These backdrops with kind of neoclassical and neo-Gothic architecture, lots of columns and clock towers and spires, right? And stairs. Lots and lots and lots of stairs, right? And then against that very traditional backdrop, as we see in this image, this is the School of Scaring at Monsters University, and it has this neoclassical facade with columns and a whole bunch of stairs leading up to this big giant door into the building. There's a clock tower in the background, a fountain in the foreground, and across that very traditional background, they've laid out the most diverse range of bodies, right? All kinds of different monsters. Of course, we're supposed to recognize campuses like these. We're supposed to associate that with university life. In the next slide here, you see a slug kind of monster. This is from the very beginning of the movie. As the opening credits are rolling and the clock tower is chiming and all the students are rushing off to class, the slug has their backpack on and is rushing to get to class. But the kind of joke here is that the slug is not going to make it on time, right? And this is the way the movie functions. It has this very traditional backdrop. We learn of a very traditional curriculum, right? With lots and lots of barriers in place. And it doesn't fit the diversity of the students who are trying to learn there, right? It becomes a machine for rejection. The happy ending of the movie is that the students, the main characters in the film, drop out. And that's the happy ending. They give up on the kind of false meritocracy. They give up on the kind of absurdity of what they're asked to do at the university, and they go out on their own. I think it's disturbing because I think this movie is probably the place where our culture, most people come to learn about university. And it's mostly kids, it's mostly people who haven't been to a university, right? We should probably be a little bit bothered that the happy ending of the movie has the students dropping out, right? But I pointed out mainly because of that architectural kind of backdrop, right? The idea that it's normal and actually built into the environment to be a difficult place for diverse bodies to move, right? And that some folks could be going to be marked out for wearing out. And the university itself will perform this kind of function of deciding who makes it up the stairs to the ivory tower and who doesn't, right? So I also think that metaphor is useful because I want you to think about yourself on those stairs to the ivory tower, right? How has that steep steps mentality shaped your own education? Who and what helped you up the stairs? Where were they steepest or most difficult? What pushed you back? And where did you start on the stairs based on your own privilege or lack of privilege, right? So the truth is then, against this kind of backdrop, and in Ontario we know, and you know at Queen's, I know at the University of Waterloo, part of the history here is that we built universities and the architecture of these spaces were also aligned with the architecture of other places like institutions where folks with disabilities were warehoused, right? One place being the location for the education of the most fit, right? And another place being where those who were not given opportunity were warehoused, right? And there were relationships between universities and institutions over time as well. That's one of my areas of research right now. So against that kind of backdrop, what kind of tools have we been given? Well, instead of having the steep stairs in the front of a building like this, right, we now have ramps around the back, right? The building that I'm working in here at the University of Waterloo, it's a brutalist building, right? Lots of concrete stairs everywhere. But the elevator in the building is as far away from my office and offices and teaching spaces as can be. It's the freight elevator. It's at the part of the building where the garbage comes in and out, right? And we can say that the building is accessible, right? But it's very minimally accessible. And so I use this slide here to talk about that retrofitting approach to access that we've had, to adjust what we're doing just barely, right? Only to allow disabled people in the door, right? And to be able to say that our buildings are no longer as inaccessible as they used to be, or our classrooms, or our pedagogy, or the curriculum, or the culture on campus, right? But still leaving people with disabilities in really difficult places. And the image I'm showing here is a tweet that was posted by a student named Sarah Marie De Silva from the University of Hull in the UK. She posted the picture on Twitter showing how she's forced to take in her zoology lectures at Hull. Right, this is an amphitheater style classroom. I know you have them at Queen's. I have them down the hallway from me here at University of Waterloo. And in that kind of classroom, the entrance is at the highest point in the room, at the back of the room. Students come in that entrance and they go down a set of stairs to access tables or desks that are laid out horizontally across the room as you go down. Right, so in this image, students have come in, they've gone down the stairs, they've filed into the tables, they have their laptops open and their coffees, and they're taking in the zoology lecture. But Sarah Marie, because she's in a manual wheelchair, there's only one space for her to sit, and it's at the back of the room in the little vestibule where the door opens and closes, right? Her access is really clearly an afterthought, right? And her participation is already really minimized in the classroom. The issue, and I think, an image like this should show us why it's a metaphor for the ways that we are continue to lose disabled students. They may be included, but it's much more difficult to be full participants and to thrive on our campuses, right? And I use this image in particular because if you go to the University of Hull, they have something that's called the Access Map. And it's a kind of map where they brag about all the different classrooms and spaces on campus that are accessible. And this classroom is marked on that map, and they're bragging about this as an accessible classroom. The reason for that, if you look very carefully at the back of the image, is that there's a push button door there to access this space, right? So they've spent 5,000, 6,000 pounds to install that push button door at the back of the room that can help people in wheelchairs or other folks to open a door that's heavy or hard to open and to keep it open. The irony here, of course, is that they've spent that money, they've added that accessibility feature, and anybody who comes and presses that door when Sarah Marie is there, that door is going to hit Sarah Marie, right? She's going to have to wait to be the last person to enter the space because anybody else coming in, the door is going to hit her. I mean, you can understand and appreciate all of the different kind of entailments of that fact, right? So we spend money to make things accessible, right? We brag about it, right? But in the end, those things can create barriers just as easily as they can remove them, right? And with that sense of barriers, I also want to show an image here, and this was created by students at the University of Iowa to sort of recognize and make real some of the barriers that are unseen and not understood by folks on campus, right? Most of the time, the only time that we recognize or think about disability is in those couple of sentences at the end of a syllabus, right? Or it's in that disability service office that sometimes the students point out here at their university, it's located in a dorm basement, right? But that is the only location where disability really has a presence on campus, right? And the students then show it's an iceberg in this image. The thing that's visible above the water is that disability services office, right? But underneath the water, the other parts of that iceberg of institutional barriers include things like ableist language use, compulsory self-advocacy, no disability cultural center, a lack of faculty and staff with disabilities, or a lack of visibility for faculty and staff with disabilities. Limited disability awareness, campus inaccessibility, all of these other things that are unseen and not necessarily really well understood, right? All of those barriers then, I think, speak to the outcomes that I'm talking about, right? They force or push disabled students away from access to education on our campuses, right? And I want to say, I think offices of disability services are doing excellent work, really important work, right? But the average operating budget of an Office of Disability Services is around $160,000, right? And it's not increasing, right? And so it's not, that cannot be the only place where we think about disability or we think about the barriers that students are facing, right? Another thing that's really important in terms of disclosure and the outcomes for disabled students is we need to understand that disability is never alone with itself, right? Disability is intersectional with other identities, right? And disability diagnoses in K to 12 education, for example, for Black or Indigenous students, those kinds of labels are used to move those students away from the possibility of college and higher education, right? A recent report in the Toronto District School Board showed that having, quote, special educational needs in high school meant you were much less likely to go to university, and that's been getting worse over time and not better. Being a student of color also makes you much more likely to be labeled with those special educational needs. As Keith May's excellent new book, The Unteachables, shows, all of the labels that we have for disability in education have traditionally been used to protect white students, right, and to stream Black, Indigenous, and students of color away from outcomes like college and university. So we can't expect that those students will have the same kind of relationship with disability on campus, or with disclosure, right, or with the labels and diagnoses that we have for disability as other students will. We also need to think about the context for international students in Canada right now, right? That world is changing a lot. Those students are looped into immigration and work visa processes that are really deeply medicalized and often discriminatory. So we can't expect that their levels of disclosure or their comfort with disclosure is going to be the same. But we don't do too much to change the help, right? And that's why I'm saying today, I think that's what we need to do, right? The other thing to say is disability is all over our campuses. It's all over the curriculum on campus, right? But not as a culture or an identity, right? At Queen's, at Waterloo, right? We understand that universities create doctors and special educators and therapists who know how to who learn how to cure or rehabilitate disability, right? But seeing disability as a fixable or eradicable thing is very, very different from seeing disability as a culture or as an identity, right? And again, I don't think we can really face the complicated problems that we have as a society if disabled students are absent from our classrooms, labs, and research teams. So here's where we are. We have what I think are thousands of disabled students on our campuses who are not going to work their way through the bureaucracy that might allow them to access accommodations. They're facing an ableist culture, but they're also coming up against other barriers like the ones we've been talking about here, right? The other piece is if they do go through all of the hoops that they need to jump through to get a doctor, to get a new diagnosis, right, to disclose a disability, what's being offered is important, right? And they have the right to it. But in many ways, it's the same thing over and over again, right? More than 3/4 of accommodations offered are the same exact thing, which is extended time on tests and exams, right? At the University of Victoria last year, just as one example, there were 18,000 accommodated exams written in their exam center, right? Because of this sheer scope of time test extensions, disability actually has been primarily come to be understood in higher education through that framework of time testing, right? That framework is already framed and filtered through anxiety about fairness achieving. The St. Anya shows is culture that has eroded trust between students and teachers, between schools and teachers and students, right? It's a culture that isolates individual learners. It's a culture of competition, and it's a culture of scarcity, right? And it's not central to the mission of teaching and learning, right? It's about assessment. It's sad, but if you go and do a Google Scholar search for disability and higher education, almost all of the results you get are going to be about whether it's fair to give time test extensions, right? And that's really tough because that is not the main thing that we do. If you go to the Queen's website, you'll see pictures of students there. They're not sitting in an exam center or a gymnasium taking tests, right? They're out in the community doing community engaged learning, right? They're doing experiential learning. They're working with robots and cutting edge labs, right? And all these interesting things. They're building a future sustainable, economy. But that's really hard because disabled students are then stuck in that paradigm that's from the 30s and 40s, right? The kind of the wholesale testing paradigm, right? That is not the future of learning. And so that's really difficult, right? That said, okay, we have had an opportunity over the last 4 or 5 years to make some major changes in higher education, right? The tough thing is that we weren't really thinking and talking as much about accessibility as part of that process as we could have, right? Um, I said that the vast majority of students on our campuses are not going to seek accommodations. Those who do, they're going to get extended time on tests and exams, right? But the big question, and what I wish that when you went to Google Scholar, you got research that showed you, what disabled students could actually, what kind of accommodations they could actually use, right? And there's very little of that research, right? One of the only major studies to ask that question was done at the University of Illinois, and this was done before the pandemic, right? This was done with more than 300 students with disabilities in an engineering program at the University of Illinois, right? 49 different courses. And here's what students were asking for, okay? They wanted to have the lectures that they took in their classrooms. They wanted to have access to them outside of that 50 minutes or 80 minutes of class. So as videos or transcripts or notes, right? They wanted to have access to course, textbook, and instructor notes and slides outside of class they could engage with online. Right? In Ontario, we came to understand this was asynchronous learning during the pandemic, right? That students wanted flexibility around attendance policies, physical attendance, right? The ability to miss some classes and to make up that work, right? And for years, students with disabilities asked for these things and were told that they were impossible, right? And then during the pandemic, we learned that we could do this for everybody. And in fact, we said to students, no, you have to pay your full tuition and you're getting the same value of education as you did before. But now everybody has flexibility for physical attendance, right? And everybody gets to learn asynchronously. So there's some irony there. I think that disabled people were asking for those things before, but it's a good thing that we learned how to do some of those things. And I think part of my point would be we should keep doing those things. Asynchronous access to lectures and class content, class discussion, all those kinds of things are things we can do that can make a big difference for our students, right? I want to be able to answer questions because I'm sure people will have them, but I think we need to test less, right? And I can give you some tangible examples of how we could do that, right? Especially because we need to expand the repertoire of accommodations that we have for students. And we're wasting so much of the budget and the energy and the labor that we have around disability simply giving people extra time on tests and exams, which doubles down on our commitment to tests and exams, I think at a time in Canada when we should not be doing that. Right? When the public needs to be able to see higher education as something much bigger than a big assessment machine, right? The other thing I think is that for disabled students, if they're learning in their 4, 5, 6 years in university, that the only way that they get accommodated for their learning is to get extra time on tests and exams, that's not going to help them in their future careers, right? There are real accommodations that they can expect and they will get in the workplace, right? But the accommodations we offer in higher education need to be closer to those kinds of accommodations so that they can learn how they learn better. I think that's the right of every student, right? Okay, so this is, as you can tell, this is kind of a Three Little Pigs type of talk. I talked about steep steps, talked about the accommodations and retrofits that we offer to kind of adjust around that classical model of education, right? And the solution, there's no magical solution, but the philosophy that I look to is universal design, right? So we can think about those steep steps at Monsters University. We can think about that classroom at the University of Hull where Sarah Marie is stuck at the back, right? And then we could also think that spaces can be designed from the very beginning to foreground accessibility, right? If a space is designed for disabled people first, it's more accessible for everybody. And then that's not just about space. It's about all the tools we use in the kitchen and scissors and utensils, right? Using disability design made those things better for everybody. Every single cool technology that you have on your phone was originally a niche expensive, difficult to access technology that was made only for people, right? But design from and through disability has revolutionized design and architecture, right? The image I use for universal design and architecture is the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, and that's the slide that you're seeing here. It's in Winnipeg. If you have been, I really highly recommend that you go. And it was designed from the beginning to be highly accessible for disabled people. And the outcome is that it's a very accessible and beautiful space. And the architecture of the space fits the mission of the museum, right? The building itself looks like a kind of large spiral with ribbons of stone wrapping around it and narrowing towards the sky. But everyone comes in the same way on the ground level, and that spiraling and ribboning is mirrored by the ramps throughout the space. There's very few stairs, no stairs in the main space at all of this building, right? Instead, everybody follows these ramps that sort of circulate around the interior of the building all the way up to the top of it, right? The architect who designed the building described those ramps as ribbons of circulation, right? And I think it's important for a museum of human rights, but also for an institution of higher education, right? That to build for the inclusion of everybody, and that extends from architecture through to pedagogy and the curriculum, right? We avoid treating disability like a surprise, right? The way that Sarah Marie da Silva was treated in her classroom. We also stop wasting resources demanding that disabled people have to individually adapt themselves around a culture that won't change, right? When we remove barriers, we realize then that designing from and through disability is better for everybody, right? And out of that, sorry, here's another image that shows those ramps on the inside of the building, right? And the ways that allows folks to circulate through the building, all on the same pathway, nobody with a special backdoor kind of access. Out of this architectural movement, we built what's called universal design for learning, right? And advocates for multiple and flexible teaching and learning strategies to address the needs of all students. The three major tenets of universal design for learning are multiple means of representation, to give learners various ways of acquiring information and knowledge, right? We learned how to do that really well with asynchronous learning, right? Making sure that students had more than one way to access a class discussion, for example, right? Or that they didn't have to sit and write notes for an entire class because students were taking turns sharing notes, right? Or the professor was going to share their lecture notes, or there was going to be a transcript, right, for what was happening in the class, right? The second piece then is multiple means of expression to give learners a variety of alternatives for demonstrating what they know, right? And this gets down, and I know it's you can tell it's a kind of soapbox issue for me, but testing, right, especially time testing, it's not a good way to understand what people know or what they've learned in our class, right? Research shows that it doesn't make students study harder or more effectively. It doesn't help them retain information, right? There's no good research-based reason to make a test or exam timed, right? Instead, I think we need to build and experiment with more flexible ways for students to show us what they know, right? And what they've learned in our classes. The final piece then is multiple means of engagement, right? All the stuff that's on the Queen's webpage, the future of learning, right? Tapping into learners' interests, offering appropriate challenges, meeting students where they are and where they're motivated, right? And unfortunately, for disabled students, they've been stuck in this old factory learning, industrial paradigm, right? Where all they get is a little bit of extra time to be tested, right? And I think they have the right to that future of learning and that engaged learning, right? And motivated learning that we brag about on our home pages. Okay, so I think we have to begin thinking about universal design because, as you'll recall, students are not seeking help. And this cohort, this generation of students is seeking help less than in the future. And that help is not, that we've not properly adjusted that help to take into account the context from which students are coming to us, right? Students, it's impossible for us to even get a family doctor, so we can't assume that it's going to be easy for students to get medical diagnoses over and over again to access help the traditional ways that they have, right? I'm almost done here. I have just a few more things to talk about, and then I really want to get to our discussion. But I think we also know that there's one big unspoken barrier right now in Ontario, right? And that's the state of funding in higher education, right? It's really bleak. Universities have been forced into giant deficits because the government's frozen funding at the lowest levels in Canada, right? In Ontario, per student funding is the lowest, and it's way lower than even the next lowest funded province, right? And tuition is frozen, right? And now the federal government is freezing international student visas, right? So financially, it's an unbelievable squeeze. And we can get that can subsume everything, right? It's too real, and it's right in our face all the time, right? The conversation then, unfortunately, sometimes stops being about how we can make education better, right? It's more about how many jobs might be lost, right? Or which universities and programs are going to be frozen or cut, right? So it's unlikely in that kind of atmosphere that supports for disabled students are going to increase, right? We know that class sizes will probably rise. We know that faculty levels will lessen, right? And that means we will have to work harder, right? But I think when we work harder, we can work more carefully as well to build inclusive practices into our classrooms in sustainable ways, right? If we don't, we know that we're going to continue to lose students with disabilities. And on a national level, like a provincial level, we need that productivity and that intellectual potential. We can't be losing people, right? The students with disabilities in this context, it would be way too easy to construct them as a drain on resources, right? We know that sometimes that's already happening, right? But I think we can do this. We can expand access, and we can do it in a really smart and careful way, right? People in universal design for learning, they talk about +1 thinking. So instead of saying you need to rejig all of your classroom practices right away, right, and change everything tomorrow, they say choose just one practice, right? Implement that in terms, what happens with it, and then build on that, right? If we try to build one inclusive practice into the classroom every time we teach, then eventually we have a much more inclusive classroom. And during our discussion, I can give you lots of examples about what those +1s might be, right? I'll also say my book, Academic Ableism, which is available free. Whoa, I stopped sharing. Give me one sec. Which is available free and open access online. It also has is that going to be yeah, there you go. It also has a list of thousands of universal design ideas, right? And these slides and my talk notes have been shared with you so you can access those. I'll also put that link into the chat when I'm done speaking. So lots of things you can do in the classroom tomorrow, those +1s. But I think the important part is we also need to take some things away, right? I talk about -1 thinking for barriers and retrofits, right? It's a good time for us now, right, to pull back on testing, pull back on assessment so that we can teach more, right? And I can give you some more examples of how to do that when we have our discussion. So, okay, we have our 3 images to end with today. We have that classical backdrop of education, the one in which, that slug at the end of the movie, as the closing credits are rolling, that slug is still struggling to get to class, right? And we've inherited that, but it's a system in which students with disabilities are getting left behind, where it's taking them much longer to graduate. They have much more debt when they do, but a lot of them are not succeeding, right? And we need those folks because we can't do the research we need to do. We can't solve the problems we need to solve if we don't have the central input of disabled people, right? Then we have the image of Sarah Marie stuck at the back of the class. And in that model, we can keep prodding out a syllabus that has this statement that says, hey, students, go somewhere else, get an adjustment, and then come back to my class and I won't change anything, right? And in that model, we know that we're losing disabled students as well, right? But in that final, example of the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, right? How can we build classrooms and curriculum, student services and resources, right? Every aspect of campus life. How can we build it from the beginning, right? So that all students are welcome and so that all students can come in at a kind of level entrance and have access to the things we have to share with them. So thanks for your time. I think we've got lots of time for discussion now.
Yes, thank you so much, Jay, for such a excellent, informative presentation. I was just furiously scribbling notes over here. Um, so I think what we'll do is I'll ask you a couple of questions, and then we'll open it to the floor for participants to ask. Um, so the first thread that I wanted to pull out was the line that you said that really resonated with me, and that was at the very beginning around, like students know that accommodations exist, and yet, as evidenced by the stats that you cited, a lot of them are not asking for help, right? Because, and I quote, something on campus is telling them not to seek help. And so the questions I want to ask are kind of centered around those sort of hidden or unspoken barriers that exist. A lot of them were in that iceberg infographic that you shared from University of Iowa. So I feel like what this really points to is that a culture shift is needed, not more policies, not having a blurb like the requisite blurb in a syllabus, something else. So my first question is around power dynamics. And so in higher ed, as we all know, power dynamics really shape every aspect of student life, right? Including whether or not students feel like they can ask for help or seek support. Faculty obviously hold considerable authority over a lot of things: grades, participation, the culture of the classroom itself. Um, so for disabled students, these dynamics really can be particularly fraught, and could also be further complicated by age, their positionalities, their race, their culture.
Yeah.
Okay, so my question is, how do power dynamics between faculty and staff and students influence these help-seeking behaviors of disabled students?
Sure. I mean, one thing I didn't even get to cover in the talk, but I just want to say, like, these things are reproduced, that the lack of disclosure is reproduced for faculty and staff as well, right? Very few universities in Canada even have an accommodations policy, a proper accommodations policy for faculty and staff, right? Here at University of Waterloo, I've been working for 9 years to try and build a policy. And the higher administration keeps slowing it down, right? Keeps refusing to finalize it. There's nothing compelling. Doug Ford's not going to make them do it, right? The AODA is not making them do it. And so they won't, right? I'm hopeful that we eventually will. And when we do, I'll share it with you all, because every university in Ontario needs one. Because without it, right, I'm forced to disclose my disability to my chair or my dean, right? That's not somebody that I'm comfortable sharing a diagnosis with. And they're not trained to properly safeguard my privacy and confidentiality. They shouldn't want me to disclose to them, right? Because of the power dynamic. They're a colleague, but they're also somebody who can determine my future, right? They determine my teaching, my tenure, my promotion, all of these things, right? And there's no centralized budget for disability accommodations, so they would come out of a departmental budget. And you all know what that means nowadays, right? Who's going to disclose a disability, right? Even with minimal cost in today's financial climate, right? And so what happens? Staff and faculty don't disclose either. And that's a major problem, because students need to be able to see faculty and staff with disabilities, right? But there's a danger in disclosing for faculty and staff, right? The other piece, I think, is that the truth is, because disability accommodations have been framed and filtered through testing and assessment and grades mainly, right? We think of an accommodation, unfortunately, as something that is tightly attached to a grade. I don't know if the researcher is here, but Queen's researcher, there was a really, there's a lot written about this study that was done by Alison Harrison, who's a psychologist at Queen's, right, around accommodations. And that was a really damaging study, because it made it seem as though Office of Disability Services were just giving out accommodations left, right, and center, right? And I've shown you what the data is, that that's not the case, right? But an accommodation should be something that helps a student to feel like part of the classroom. It should help them to learn, right? But unfortunately, we see it as too tightly connected with grades. And then the main thing, I think, is we just have unbelievably competitive, individualistic cultures amongst undergraduate students. I think Queens and Waterloo might be the two most ableist places for that, right? So if you got into Queens or you got into Waterloo, um, you're somebody who's already been very good at being individually competitive, right? And the culture on campus is one in which you must have to work harder, right? You're gonna have to study harder than you ever did before, right? And asking for help is not really part of the culture. We have situations here where so many Waterloo students go to co-op, right? When they go to co-op, the employers really don't like Waterloo students very much. Don't spread that around, right? But they don't like them because they're too competitive. They don't know how to work with cooperatively with other people, right? They don't know how to be reflective about the work that they do or to take feedback, constructive feedback, right? But that's because what they've learned on campus is how to compete with one another, right? How to study alone, right? So in any case, I think that gets a little bit at what you're talking about, Kate, but I think it's something we have to keep examining because it's not a good fit with the real world, some of the values that students are learning here.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was also a big thread that I also picked out, and something that really resonated with me is that I've had very heated discussions with a lot of my colleagues who feel the same way, just so we know, just
Sure.
about,
Yeah.
like the pushback that we get when we talk about accommodations. And it's like a lot of faculty really push this narrative that, well, they need to be prepared for the real world, for the real world. It's like,
Yes.
we're in the real world. It's happening right now.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely, absolutely.
And the truth is, in the real, I just want to say this,
Yeah,
I said it once, but it's worth repeating. In the real world, in future careers, students with disabilities will have many more accommodations than we're offering on our campuses, right? And some of them are very simple, right? And some of them are more complicated, but we're not offering any of those. And so then we're truly misfitting what we're doing to that real world. Yeah.
absolutely. Um, so my next question has to do around language, right? And you just mentioned how asking for help is not a part of the culture because it becomes attached to this stigma um, that is antithetical to this like competitive, individualistic culture that exists, right? And is not unique to Canadian universities, but is, yeah, anyways. So the language, right, around how we communicate around disability, but also how we frame like values and norms. Um, the words that we use to describe disability that have already
Yeah.
become outdated, right? Like terms like special needs,
Yeah.
burden, exception, even help, right, can really reinforce these stigmatizing narratives,
Yeah.
even when it's
Yeah.
unintentional. So again, how does the language that we use around support and disability and accommodations help again shape this culture on campus?
Yeah, it's like the office here for students with disabilities is called the Access Ability Office. Capital A, right? Um, and I think around language, like for a lot of folks with disabilities, they are connected with other disabled people. They are connected with disability culture, right? Um, they know and they understand when the language is doesn't match with the culture, right? But we're not doing a lot to follow the lead of the students, right? In North America, there in the States, there's a lot more of what are called disability cultural centers,
Yeah.
right? And that's the main presence on campus for disability, right? Um, and that goes a long way, right? It doesn't replace the fact that there's accommodations. It doesn't replace that there's services specifically for students with disabilities. But it says disability is not just a medical diagnosis, right? It's not just a medical diagnosis that you lay out to get a legal minimum, you know. It's a lot more than that. There's a culture. There's there can be a positive identity around disability, but it's really baked into across the research and the curriculum on campus, right? We still have a lot of programs where the language is problematic, right? Where disability is something to be cured or rehabilitated, right? Or eradicated. And that's really difficult. But that's what it is for all identity groups. There's a bit of a friction there, right? And universities are great places for us to work through that friction, right? So yeah, I think the key is in our own syllabi for folks who are here, right? Looking for examples of disability culture, right? Making sure your syllabus has disabled people, right? And their research and their, creative products and their artifacts, right? As part of the curriculum so that it's not only the statement about disability services in your syllabus, right? That disability as a culture and identity is part of that in a humanities classroom, right? In an engineering classroom, in an ethics classroom, wherever and whatever it is, right? So when we can do that, then we start changing the conversation. The language starts to shift, and that matters, right? And folks with students with disabilities, including ourselves and our colleagues, we begin to understand, okay, this is part of who we are as Canadians, right? It's part of who we are as learners. It's not easy, but it's +1, right? One bit of disability culture in your syllabus next term can go a long way, right? And then see where it takes you.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And that segues perfectly into the last question I'll ask, and then we'll open it to the floor. So you had mentioned, rightfully so, that across Canadian universities, accessibility offices are understaffed and overworked. So there is an opportunity here to look elsewhere in the campus culture where change can be made. And obviously, an obvious place to look is faculty, right? And so in talking about +1s and in talking about incorporating disability culture into the classroom, there's also other ways in which they can sort of create this, I'm familiar with Sarah Curry's work and creating a culture of care, right, in the classroom. Like, for example, the ways in which instructors talk about accommodations, the way they whether or not they have participation marks, or the way that they talk about flexibility, are all potential entry points into expanding visibility of disability culture. So my question is, what role can faculty play in dismantling those stigmas associated with disability and accommodations?
Sure. So I think the first piece is realizing that you have disabled students in your classroom right now, right? Or maybe you're not teaching right now, you just finished the term, you're getting ready to teach next fall. As you begin preparing your syllabus for fall, know that there will be disabled students, probably 4 or 5 of them in every class, and that they're not necessarily going to seek to go through the Office of Disability Services, right? And instead of saying, oh, well, they better, I bet, how can I figure out how to get them to do that? Know and understand that there are some serious barriers in place to being able to do that. And know and understand that you're doing more in class than just testing. So there are different ways to accommodate what you're doing for those students. I guess the final piece then is, so 2 things. One, those adjustments that you make that aren't for individual students, but just assume that everybody in the classroom may have some barriers to learning, right? Those are going to really help all students, right? And the second piece is, the research really bears this out. When you pay attention to accessibility and when you show students that you're modeling that approach, Everybody learns better. You have better outcomes because, like Kate, like you said, what you're doing is modeling that care, right? Modeling that environment in which we're willing to make changes, right, that suit other students. The truth is, we teach very much the way that we were taught, and we teach assuming that everybody learns the way that we do, right? And that's not the case, right? If you had to live with other learners during the pandemic, you figured out, okay, wow, people in this house learn very differently than I do, right? It's the same thing in your classroom, right? And so I think more we go that channel, how to learn and do this the way that I do, right? Then things can become more accessible in the classroom. Um, and know that something as simple as having a more flexible participation policy, right? And I'll share my own participation policy maybe in the chat, right? One that allows students to show us different ways they might participate, right? Rather than saying it's about putting your hand up and asking questions. That kind of thing, modeling that kind of flexibility is going to have outcomes that are beyond just that one little bit of the curriculum, because students are going to see that you care, right? And that really matters, right? It actually is essential to creating an environment for teaching and learning. While we're chatting and waiting for other questions, I am going to put a couple of things into the chat just because I said I promised that I would.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
We'll hold on. There is a question in the Q&A. So I'll just wait until you add your links in.
Oh, it's okay. You can ask. I can
ask? Okay.
I can multitask here. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. My attention span is not as strong, so hats off to you. Okay, so being anonymous, as I'm a precarious academic, how do we resist the efforts of universities to increasingly restrict online course offerings when they are more accessible and sometimes the only accessible option for a great many students and many faculty members as well? In particular, I've been so angered by universities' de facto denial that we continue to live and work in the midst of a dangerous pandemic.
Yeah.
I will add an editorial note here and just say an emphatic hell yeah. So.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's going to be possible. Oh, that didn't come across as a link. Hold on, sorry, one second. I don't think it's going to be possible to limit online learning. Okay, let me say a couple of things about that, and that's probably not going to work either. I'll figure out how to do that later. But I mean, students are going to vote with their feet and their butts, right? Like no, students don't want all their classes to be online, right? But at the University of Waterloo, if they're taking 5, sometimes 6 courses a term, they want one of them to be online. It's the only way to actually even ever catch up with the work. They need one where they can just take in the content on the weekend. They're drinking from the absolute fire hose of curriculum, right? I mean, it's part of my research right now, but like, what is a credit hour anymore? There's been this unbelievable inflation in the amount of content and deliverables in a class, right? And so an online course it's not about it being online, it's a self-paced course. That's why students want them, right? The majority of students that I meet with. It's also one less logistical piece, an unbelievable logistical puzzle that is a day for a university student. Students these days work, so professors, we had jobs when we were undergrads, right? But nowhere near the degree that students work and have jobs now. And the jobs we had were nothing like the ones they have now, right? So when we understand that, we can see, okay, what does online learning offer that I'm not offering in my regular class? And can I begin offering some of those things in my regular class? A little bit more self-paced learning, right? A little bit less of a stream of content, right? A little bit less difficulty around the logistics of everything I need to fit in my day. And that might take the shape of a more flexible policy around attendance. It's okay to miss a few classes. It's okay to have an extended deadline, right? Nobody's coming to knock on my door this afternoon to tell me when my work's due, because I'm trusted to do good work in a given period of time, right? And I think we should extend that to students a little bit more. But, you know, we know, unfortunately, the pandemic showed us that universities did not do a great job of really showing us they cared about our health and safety, right? We were offline, we were online the next day, and we weren't involved in the decisions and we just kept happening. We had to be nimble, we needed to plan that way, right? And that was really too much to ask in such a short period of time for us to keep pivoting and changing direction, right? But I think maybe some of that flexibility, being able to offer some of that to our students, we shouldn't have gone back to a culture where a student fears coming to class when they don't feel well, right? We're back in that culture again, right? We know where that got us before. So it's such a good question, and I know I'm not answering all of the different ways that I want to answer it. But I would say the universities that restrict the number of online courses that students are able to take will soon find that their enrollments are going down because students need them, right? And it's a much better to think, how can we make sure that those classes are offering really high quality experiences for students, including the opportunity to build community in those classes? Don't tell me you can't build community online. We did it. We do it, right? But also, how can we extend some of the flexibility that are offered in those online classes, which is the reason why I think they're so attractive? How can we build some of that flexibility into the on-campus classes that we have, right? Knowing that students have very, very different demands, that a student's day looks very different than what my day looked like in 1999 when I was an undergraduate. To me, the biggest piece, and this really matters, and it's much bigger than just an individual classroom or an individual student. The general public right now distrusts higher education. It is not a negative politically to be squeezing higher ed. It's not going to lose you votes, right? And yet we're approaching, most likely, unfortunately, a period of real financial instability. And colleges are already out ahead here saying we can't have a period of financial instability and not be offering high quality training for people, right? Well, we can't, universities, we need to get our image right here, right? We need to hit the right points here. We need to show that we're being very responsible with public trust and public funding, right? Even this very, very small amount that we're getting right now, we can't make it look like we're the Hunger Games, right? We have to make it look like we're a place where you can trust that when your kid or your partner or your friend goes there, no matter what that student brings to the table, they're going to get something really positive out of the investment that we have made in public education, right? And so I think constructing ourselves as testing machines is not helpful, right? Saying, in fact, that we're pulling back on that assessment mechanism, that we're caring less about grades, we're caring more about real world, right? Collaboration, cooperation, right? Interdependency, right? And that we're listening. Like, we can model that as universities, and that will have value, rhetorical and real value, in showing that, hey, we're willing to make some changes, right? Otherwise, I just think it's going to continue to be a political win to watch us struggle. But on the micro level, on the individual classroom level, I think that's one of the biggest pieces, is showing that we're willing to make some changes, right, to our students within the course of an individual term, right? That there will be some flexibility in how students are assessed, right? That we might say, take away a major time test or exam, right? Or a major assessment. Have students grade it themselves, right? Have students reflect on it themselves, right? So that we can take a little bit more time at the beginning of term, for example, to have one-on-one conferences where, when I do that, I can talk to students about the accommodations that I need, right? I can open a discourse and a dialogue with students about what they need as learners, right? And then maybe you have more.
You cut out for the last maybe 10 seconds.
Oh,
If you want to
shoot.
just reiterate your last point, and then I think we will just move on to the next question, just for the
Okay.
time.
I am interested in hearing what you have to say too, Kate. That was the main thing I said was like if you wanted to add anything.
I mean, I obviously agree. I do think that I think that faculty are scared to change the way that they assess students, just because it's obviously risky to try new assessments. It's risky to introduce a new model when you don't know how it'll work. It's hard to do at scale sometimes, right? Um, yeah, I mean, for me, the focus primarily is on the micro level, on the individual classroom level, and just focusing on ways to introduce levels of care and on in one-on-one interactions as well. I think is really fundamental. But I will say, I'll just plug briefly, if there's any faculty from Queens who are here and are thinking about wanting to introduce like ungrading or different forms of assessment or feedback, please reach out to our Center for Teaching and Learning, because they have educational developers who are there to, that is their whole job. They're there to help you reformat your classroom. So please do so. Okay, I will move on to the next question. I just need to open my chat. Okay. From the Q&A, so much for a great presentation. Would you be able to provide any insights or examples around applying universal design and universal design for learning in research design and practice? Or perhaps we need a specific universal design framework for research.
There is a little bit out there. Okay, there's not a ton, but there are kind of disability studies research methodologies, and there are some publications there. If you want to email me, I'll send you a bibliography. Okay, I'm such a prof, and I'm good at that. If you came in my office, you'd leave with 3 books or something, you know. But so I could do that. I think there's 2 ways of looking at that. One is ensuring that disabled folks are part of the research team, right? And all the different ways that we need to adapt research environments to make sure that they're accessible, right? That we're making sure that any kind of like usability testing or anything like that, prototyping, all that stuff, we get feedback from disabled users. They should be central to the feedback we get about user experience for any of the research we do. And then the other piece, though, is like making sure that when we disseminate our research results, we do so really accessibly, right? So that we make research highly accessible for disabled people to be able to access it. And it's often much easier than you think, right? My own journal, the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies, if you want to go there, it's www.cjds. What is it? Anyway, it's easy to find. CJDS, put it in Google, you'll find it. But even just the alternate formats that we have for all of the articles there, that's an important piece too, just making sure that disabled people can access the research and read it and share it, right? There's kind of so much more I could say about that, but again, please do email me directly. And I would say this to anybody here, if you have a more specific question, please do email me. If I was there in person, we get to stand around and have cookies or something, and we don't get to do that, but see my email inbox as an opportunity to chat a little bit more with anybody.
An essential connection that needs to be clearly and strongly articulated is that the culture of ableism that permeates post-secondary culture and beyond, the barriers that have been created, the toxic testing and assessment culture, the ableist pedagogies and curriculums, etc., the relationship denial and dehumanization, these are all a product and perpetuation of ongoing colonization. I feel do you want to comment on that? It's not really a question, but just sort of an observation.
I think it's a powerful statement, and I agree. I think that it's. I write about that more specifically in Disabled Upon Arrival, a little bit in Academic Ableism, but I think it's part and parcel of the same kind of creation of binaries between who studies and who gets studied. you know, and disability has been used as a tool of colonization, right? All of these labels that we have for disability, they were also labels that were used to segregate folks in schools, in institutions, right? And continue to do so, right? Those outcomes for Indigenous students in the Toronto District School Board, the statistics I talked about earlier, right? Young Indigenous students are still being filtered away, right, from the possibility of college and university, right? It's manifest in even in the student visa restrictions, right? And the kind of to be honest, racism that undergirds some of that discourse, right? And we're all seeing it, but I think it's really powerful to stop and state it in the way that you did. And thank you. I mean, I understand where it comes from because we're being asked to do a lot more with a lot less, right? Your example of losing the folks who all of those important supports that we had for example, building online learning and teaching and learning, right? Like those are just gone. And it's like now you figure out how to do it, right? And that is unlikely to change over the next 3, 4, 5 years. I hope that it will, but I'm not convinced that it will, and I'm certainly not planning that way. And so it's tough because, you know, trying something is good. I think the key to me is that there have to be bigger instruments of reward. We need to build the language in to hiring, tenure and promotion, all of the kinds of different ways, and they're often really, really low stakes, but they matter a lot to instructors. The ways that we merit, you know, our performance, right? Beyond just student evaluations of instruction, which we know are biased. We need more robust ways to do that. And if we have the language of inclusion and accessibility in those metrics, that's the only way they matter. It's the only true incentive that there is for people to do it. And those things should be there because people should be incentivized to do it. It does make a big difference. There's a huge bang for that, you know, whatever, very few bucks. But if we don't formalize it and we don't reward people, then it's really just a coalition of the willing. And nothing against all of us who come to every webinar, because I do it too, right? But we know we want to go back and we want to get colleagues to do this who might not usually consider doing it, right? There have to be real tangible rewards there, or else people won't engage, right? So it is about sharing examples, right? It can also, the other thing I should say is like, we shouldn't be doing these things alone, right? Find ways to build small groups, right? Find ways in a smaller department to say, hey, we're going to make a commitment over the next 2-year period to do this. So we're going to have teaching squares, 3 or 4 people together who are going to try something, right? Works so much better and it's so much less lonely, right? When we make some of these changes working with other people. But then if it's not written into hiring, tenure and promotion, merit review, that kind of language, if it's not there, then it won't be done. So those things matter. That's what I would say, right? There's always going to be some pushback, and there's probably going to be more pushback because we're going to be teaching larger classes probably with less support, and that's just real. I'll say to begin with, just my own experience at the University of Waterloo, we did not make any good progress around equity or diversity. It seems to have vanished. There are no cultural spaces for Black students or Indigenous students to speak of. And in the small amount of time that there was some movement on that, not enough happened. And now it feels like it's going in the complete opposite direction, right? We have what's happening in the United States where it's being targeted, right? University of Alberta just stopped using the word diversity, right? In any campus, in the campus office changed its name and so on. So it's just really difficult. Like I don't have an answer that's anything but pretty bleak. Because I do think disability is an aspect of diversity. I also think disability is never alone, right? And that disability is an issue for Indigenous students and Black students just as much as it is for other students. Probably we need more disability culture, right? We need to see disability as a culture and an identity as part of the curriculum beyond just cure and as an object to be studied, right? And we need to keep doing that work, right? But we also need to keep doing that for other groups too, right? And in solidarity with those other groups. And yet, I think that is going sideways right now, in some really scary ways, right? That make vulnerable folks, not vulnerable folks, but like folks who have traditionally been targeted, even more susceptible to being targeted, right? Um, and so I don't know what the strategy's got to be, but it's like that's what we have to figure out, right? We need to kind of work together to figure that out. My suggestion on your campus is, trying to work with some of those groups and say, what has worked for you in terms of building some more positive visibility, right? And can we do that for disabled students? And it will matter, right? It even matters to be able to show some examples, build some coalitions amongst disabled students. A small thing did here was we just created a disability students group. And they always need to have a student group, you need a faculty representative. So being willing to volunteer and then book the space, maybe buy some coffee or whatever, and then get out of the way, right? And let students decide what they want to do, what comes out of that. Something small like that might be a place to start, right, on a smaller campus. But like it's tough work. It's not going to become easier, I don't think, over the next few years.
Jay, I want to thank you so much for spending this time with us, for sharing your insights. Your work has and continues to challenge and really inspire us to reimagine what accessibility can and should look like in higher ed specifically. I'm speaking for myself, but I'm sure everyone is just so grateful to have had this chance to learn with you today. Everyone who joined us, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Yep, let's carry it forward, right? Solidarity, absolutely, into our classrooms, into our daily practices. So yeah, take care. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much, Kate, for being such a great facilitator as well. And thanks, Tracy Ann.